Hi guys, welcome to chapter 6 of the story of Tom's Midnight Garden. Sorry I didn't do it yesterday. I was in work yesterday. So here is chapter 6. We're catching up now. Okay, so if you remember before, Tom had been in the garden. He hadn't left any footprints, which he was a bit concerned about. Also as well, it looked as if somebody had been in the garden watching him while he was there. Okay, so on to the next story. So it's about Tom going back into the garden. Through a door. Every night now, Tom slipped downstairs to the garden. At first, he used to be afraid that it might not be there. Once, with his hand already upon the garden door to open it, he had turned back, sick with grief at the very thought of absence. He had not dared then to look, but later the same night he had forced himself to go again and open that door. There the garden was. It had not failed him. He saw the garden at many times of its day and at different seasons. Its favourite season was summer, which was perfect weather. In earliest summer hyacinths were still out in the crescent beds on the lawn and wallflowers in the round ones. Then the hyacinths bowed and died and the wallflowers were uprooted and stocks and asters bloomed in their stead. There was a clipped box bush by the greenhouse with a cavity like a great mouth cut into the side of it. This was stacked full of pots of geraniums in flower. Along the sundial path heavy red poppies came out and roses, and in summer dusk the evening primroses glimmered like little moons. In the latest summer, the pears on the walls were stuffed in muslin bags for safe ripening. Tom was not a gardener, however his first interest in a garden, as Peter's would have been, was tree climbing. He always remembered his first tree in this garden, one of the yews around the lawn. He had never climbed a yew before, and was inclined to think ever afterwards that yews were the best. The first trees grew conveniently low, and the main trunk had bosses and crevices. With the toes of his left foot fitted into one of these last, Tom curved his hands around the branch above his head. Then he gave a push, a spring, and a strong haul in the arms. His legs and feet were dangling free, and the branch was under his chest and then under his middle. He drew himself still further forward, at the same time twisting himself expertly. Now he was sitting on a bough, a man's height above the ground. The rest of the ascent was easy but interesting, sometimes among the spreading outermost branches, sometimes working close to the main trunk. Tom loved the dry feel of the bark on the main trunk. In places the bark had peeled away, and then a deep pink showed beneath, as though the tree was skin and flesh beneath its brown. Up he went, up, and burst at last from the dim interior into an openness of blue and fiery gold. The sun was the gold in a blue sky. All around him was spreading tufted surface of evergreen. He was on a level with all the yew tree tops around the lawn, nearly on a level with the top of the tall south wall. Tom was on a level too, with the upper windows of the house just across the lawn from him. His attention was caught by a movement inside one of the rooms. It came, he saw, from the same maid he'd seen once in the hall. She was dusting a bedroom and came now to the window to raise the sash and shake her duster outside. She looked casually across to the yew trees as she did so, and Tom tried waving to her. It was like waving to the he in a blind man's bluff. The maid went back to the depths of the room to her dusting. She left the window open behind her, and Tom could now see more. There was someone else in the room beside the maid, someone who stood against the far wall facing the window. The maid evidently spoke to her companion occasionally as she worked, for Tom could hear the faint coming and going of voices. He could not see the other figure at all clearly, except that it was motionless, and there was whiteness and a shape of a face that always turned in his direction. The steadfastness of direction embarrassed Tom. Very gradually he began to draw the head downward and then suddenly ducked it below the tree level altogether. Tom saw more people later in the garden itself. He stalked them warily, and yet, remembering his invisibility to the housemaid, with a certain confidence too. He was pretty sure that the garden was used more often than he knew. He often had the feeling of people having just gone, and an uncomfortable feeling, one which he tried to reason himself out of again and again, of someone who had not gone, someone who, unobserved, was watching him. It was a relief really to see people, even when they ignored his presence. The maid and the gardener and a severe-looking woman in a long dress of rustling purple silk, face to face with whom Tom once had come unexpectedly on a corner. She cut him dead. Visibility, invisibility. If we were invisible to the people of the garden, he was not completely so to the other creatures. How truly they saw him he could not say, but birds cocked their heads at him and flew away when he approached. And had he any bodily weight in this garden, or had he not? At first Tom thought not. When he climbed the yew tree, he had been startled to feel that no bough swung beneath him and no twig broke. Later, and this was a great disappointment to him, he found he could not, by an ordinary grasping and pushing of his hand, open any of the doors in the garden to go through them. He could not push open the door of the greenhouse, or of the little heating house behind it, or of the door in the south wall by the sundial. The doors shut against Tom were a check upon his curiosity, until he saw a simple way out. He would get through the doorways that interested him by following at the heels of the gardener. He regularly visited the greenhouse and the heating house and used the south wall door. Tom concentrated on getting through the south wall door. That entry promised to be the easiest because the gardener went through so often with his tools. There must be a tool shed somewhere through there. The gardener usually went through so quickly and shut the door so smartly behind him that there was not time for anyone else to slip through as well. However, he would be slower with a wheelbarrow, Tom judged, and he waited patiently for that opportunity. Yet even then the man somehow only made a long arm to open the door ahead of the wheelbarrow, wheeled it in very swiftly through, caught the door edge with the toe of his boot as he passed, and slammed the door in Tom's face. Tom glared at the door that was once more his barrier. Once more, without hope, he raised his hand to the latch and pressed it. As usual, he couldn't move it. His fingers seemed to have no substance. Then in anger he pressed down with all imaginable might. He knitted his brows and brought all his will to bear upon the latch until he felt that something had to happen. It did. His fingers began to go through the latch as though through the latch. Not his fingers now were without substance. His fingers went through the ironwork of the latch altogether, and his hand fell back to place by his side. Tom stared down at that ever memorable right hand. He felt it tenderly with his left to see if it was bruised or broken. It was quite unhurt, quite as before. Then he looked at the latch. It looked as real as any latch he'd ever seen before. Then the idea came to Tom that the door might be no more solid than the latch if he really tried it. Deliberately he set his side against the door, shoulder, hip and heel, and pressed. At first nothing gave, either of himself or the door, yet continued the pressure with still greater force and greater determination, and gradually he became aware of a strange sensation that he thought was numbness all down his side, but no, it wasn't that. "I'm going through," Tom gasped, and was seized with alarm and delight. On the other side of the wall, the gardener had emptied his barrow load of weeds and was sitting on the handle of his barrow in front of a potting shed, eating his midday dinner. If he'd been able to see Tom at all, he would have seen a most curious sight. A very thin slice of boy, from shoulder to foot, coming through a perfectly solid wooden door. At first, the body came through evenly from top to bottom, then the upper part seemed to stop, then the bottom part came through in its entirety, legs first. Then one arm came through and then another. Finally, everything was through except the head. The truth was that Tom was now a little lacking courage. The passing through the door of so much of his body had not been without enormous effort and peculiar, if indescribable, sensations. "Oh, I'm just resting a minute," said Tom's head on the garden side of the door. Yet he knew he was really delaying because he was nervous. His stomach, for instance, had felt most uncomfortable as it passed through the door. What would the experience be like for his head and his eyes and his ears? On the other hand, and the new idea was even worse than the old, supposing that, like a locomotive engine losing steam pressure, he lost his present force of body and willpower in this delay, then he wouldn't be able to move either forward or backwards. He'd just be caught here by the neck, perhaps forever. Just supposing someone came along on the far side of the wall who by some evil chance could see him. Supposing a whole company came. They'd see a tiny defenceless stem sticking out, an invitation to ridicule and attack. With a convulsive effort, eyes closed and lips sealed, Tom dragged his head through the door and stood, dizzy and dazed, but whole on the other side of it. When his vision cleared, he saw that he was standing directly in front of the potting shed and the gardener. Tom had never been front to front with the gardener before. He was a large framed young man with a weather-reddened face and eyes the colour of the sky itself. They now looked straight through Tom and far away. Into his mouth he was putting the last fragments of a thick bacon sandwich. He finished the sandwich, closed his eyes and spoke aloud. "For all good things I thank the Lord, and may he keep me from all the works of the devil, that he may hurt me not." He spoke with a country voice, clipped short his T's and widened his vowels so that Tom had to listen attentively to understand him. The gardener opened his eyes again and, reaching behind him, brought out another sandwich. Tom wondered in some surprise whether he said grace after every sandwich. Perhaps he never knew how much he was going to eat. The gardener went on eating, and Tom turned away to look around. He was in an orchard, but that also served for the keeping of hens, the pegging out of washing, and the kindling of a bonfire. Beyond the orchard were meadows and trees from which rose the roofs of what must be a village. While he looked, Tom was also keeping a sharp eye upon the gardener. When the man had really finished his meal, he grasped the handles of his wheelbarrow to return to his work in the garden. In a moment, Tom was beside him. He hadn't enjoyed the experience of going through a shut door, and he didn't now intend to have to repeat it. This time there was an easy way through. He got up nimbly into the empty wheelbarrow and was wheeled back into the garden in comfort. It was a long time before Tom literally found his way through a door again. Anyway, he'd seen the orchard, and that was enough in that direction. Other doors could wait. Meanwhile, he climbed the low wall at the bottom of the garden and explored the wood beyond. On the third side of the garden, he wormed his way through the hedge again and crossed the meadow. The only surprise there was a boundary, a river, clear, gentle, flowing, shallow, and green with reeds and water plants. The garden and its surroundings, then, were not in themselves outside the natural order of things, nor was Tom alarmed by his own unnatural abilities. Yet to his mind he kept coming back again and again, troubled. The constant fine weather, the rapid coming and going of seasons and the times of day, the feeling of being watched. One night all his uneasiness came to a head. He had gone from his bed into the flat upstairs and crept down about midnight as usual. He had crept to the garden door. He had found that for the first time it was night too in the garden. The moon was up, but clouds fled continuously across its face. Although there was a movement in the upper air, down below there was none. A great stillness lay within the garden, and a heavier heat than in any noon. Tom found it. He unbuttoned his pyjama jacket and let it flap open as he walked. One could smell the storm coming. Before Tom had reached the bottom of the garden, the moon had disappeared, obscured altogether by cloud. In its place came another light that seemed instantaneously to split the sky from top to bottom, and a few seconds later came the thunder. Tom turned back to the house. As he reached the porch, the winds broke out into the lower air with heavy rain and a deathly chilling of the temperature. Demons of the air seemed to let loose in that garden, and with the increasing frequency of the lightning, Tom could watch the foliage of the trees ferociously tossed and torn at by the wind, and at the corner of the lawn the tall tapering fir tree was swinging to and fro, its ivy-wreathed arms struggling wildly in the tempest, like the arms of a swaddling child. To Tom it seemed that the fir tree swung more widely each time. It can't blow over, thought Tom. Strong trees aren't often blown over. As if in answer to this, and while the wind still tore, there came the loudest thunder, with a flash of lightning that was not to one side nor even above, but seemed to come down into the garden itself and to the tree. The glare was blinding, and Tom's eyes closed against it, although only for a part of a second. When he opened them again, he saw the tree like one flame and falling. In the long instant while it fell, there seemed to be a horrified silence of the wind, and in that quiet Tom heard something, a human cry and an "Oh!" of terror that he felt himself. It came from above him, from the window of one of the upper rooms. Then the fir tree fell, stretched its length, although Tom did not know this until much later, along the grave beds of the asparagus in the kitchen garden. It fell in darkness and the resumed rushing of wind and rain. Tom was shaken by what he had seen and heard. He went back into the house and shut the garden door behind him. Inside, the grandfather clock ticked peacefully, and the hall was silent. He wondered if perhaps he'd only imagined what he'd seen outside. He opened the door again and looked out. The summer storm was still raging. The flashes of lightning were distant now. They lit up the ugly gap in the trees around the lawn where the fir tree had stood. The tree had fallen. That had been a terrible sight enough, but the cry from above troubled Tom all the more. On the next night came the greatest shock of all. He opened the garden door as usual and looked at the garden. At first he didn't understand what was odd in its appearance. Then he realised that its usual appearance was in its way an oddity. In the trees around the lawn there was no gap. The ivy-grown fir trees still towered above them. So, that was a tricky chapter. So he's been into the garden, had a good look around and climbed the fir tree. And then when he goes into the garden again the following night, he finds himself at night in the garden. There's a storm and thunder and lightning, and the lightning hits the fir tree, sets fire to it, and the fir tree falls down, or the yew tree falls down, I should say. Next day he goes back again to the garden the following night, discovers it's daytime again, but this time, oddly, the yew tree is back standing up again, almost like the thunder and lightning didn't happen. Also, as well, really importantly, Tom's going to meet somebody really important too, very, very soon. And that is the person who said, oh, when the yew tree fell down. Okay, so see you tomorrow, guys, with chapter 7.